Today's episode of the Counselling Tutor Podcast is sponsored by Web Healer. You're a counsellor in private practice and you need a website, or you've got an existing website which you need help with. Web Healer are offering Counselling Tutor Podcast listeners, that's you, £100 off the cost of a website design and build. Now, Web Healers specialise in websites for counsellors and psychotherapists. It's what they do. And the Web Healer team provide a completely non-technical, done-for-you solution, leaving you to focus your time on your clients. Operating for 20 years, Web Healer are a trusted resource amongst counsellors when it comes to getting your practice online. So get the package details and claim your £100 off coupon for your new website by going to counsellingtutor.com/website. That's counsellingtutor.com/website.
Welcome to the Counselling Tutor Podcast, the must-listen-to podcast for students of counselling and psychotherapy. Here are your hosts, Rory Lees-Oakes and Ken Kelly.
Hi, I'm Rory, and with me, as always, is Ken. How are you doing today, Ken? How are you diddling?
I'm exceptionally well. I'm diddling well, Rory. Thank you for asking. We hope that you listening to this are diddling well as well. This is the Counselling Tutor Podcast. It's episode 255. 3 topics today, starting off with theory and practice, where we're going to be looking at storing of notes that we take as counsellors and psychotherapists, and the different expectations that we may have from our agency, from a placement if we're doing a placement. So we're going to be diving deep into that. Then into practice today, where we look at a contemporary challenge, issue, or win within the world of counselling. And today, being a member of 2 ethical bodies. Is this possible? Are there any benefits to this? Are there any downsides that we might consider to this? And then we go into the CPD section of today's podcast, which is called Practice Matters. You can log this on your CPD note. We always try and cover something that is relatable to practice. And today we have an expert in. It's Josephine Hughes. Rory reached out and did an interview with Josephine, who has also done a lecture for our CPD library. And the topic is overcoming procrastination for counsellors. I think that's a really, really good topic. And it's interesting, we say this is about CPD. CPD is exploring any element of our practice, including ourselves and our self-development. So stick around for that one. Theory and practice, Rory, this is kind of where the rubber meets the road, where the theory that we learn in the classroom applies itself and shows itself within the counselling session. And today, storing notes. Now, we learn, I guess, a bit about storing notes when we're studying, but it can be quite different when you get out there in the real world, Rory.
It can be. When I was taught note studying, I was basically taught that you had your notes like religious artifacts that you kept and you guarded literally with your very being. And, through the years, I myself taught much the same thing, to our students, Ken. We'd say that, these are very important. They're records of your clients. You need to be thinking about confidentiality, what you put into notes, how you structure notes. And in fact, if you're perhaps a newer listener to the podcast and you're interested in how you should structure notes, what you should put into notes. If you go to podcast 136, Best Practice in Taking Client Notes in Counselling, we discuss the detail and the structure of how notes should be taken. But today is really about expectations of agencies. And certainly I've worked in a number of settings, and there was only 1 or 2 settings where I actually kept my notes. I was expected to input them onto a system. One was at a college. They expected me to input them onto the college system. And one was when I worked for an EAP, an employment assistance program. And they sent me their documentation and they said they had to send my notes into them and store them. And this is, of course, a kind of anathema, really, for therapists, in that, you don't give your notes up. But interestingly, I came across a article written by Peter Jenkins in the BACP Knowledge Archive. You can Google this and we'll put the put the link in the show notes. It was written in 2017, so it's slightly older now, but it talks about expectations of organizations and how notes are stored. And of course, Peter Jenkins has written a lot of literature on counselling and the law. And it's not unusual now for agencies to input onto systems. And the reason for that is what Peter Jenkins refers to in this document as continuity of care. So most of us would be quite familiar with going to see a doctor if one can see a doctor now in the UK. And you probably, if you're as old as me, you'd have the same doctor. Not anymore. You have different doctors. And what the first thing they do is they put a card into their keyboard, type in their password or whatever they do, and then your notes are brought up and they can see what the other practitioner's written. And this is one of the reasons that agencies, certainly people at National Health Service and schools, are very keen for counsellors to store their notes on the system in case that counsellor can't make it, they leave, they're dismissed, they're ill, and then there's some kind of continuity of care. And my view is, and I think that's just echoed from what the kind of ethical frameworks say, is this is acceptable as long, and this is the key thing, as the client understands where the notes are stored.
Yeah, and who has access to those notes?
Yeah.
Yeah, and it comes back to the contract, as it so often does. Are you explaining how you're taking notes, how notes are stored, and who has access to those notes to your client? Because it's their information that you're capturing. And, there's a temptation with this topic to, when we're speaking about storage of notes, to go down the GDPR route and because within notes, of course, you're keeping data from a client. But we're going to steer away from the GDPR and just stick on this one. And you mentioning back when you studied, Rory, I remember that my studies, note-taking was about the split note system, how you would give a client a number and that you would keep your notes separately without any identifying information on there, so that if those notes did get out into the world, that nobody would be able to go, oh, it's that person, because it doesn't have a name on them. It just has a reference number at the top, and that those notes weren't necessarily shared. In fact, they were, like you say, it was like the Holy Grail. One would keep it close to the chest. It's all about the confidentiality, that client being willing to share this with the person they're building trust and a relationship with. And then the thought of maybe somebody else in an agency that hasn't earned and doesn't hold that relationship having a look. For me, that brought up a lot of stuff. And when I went into placement, I was at a GP practice, and the very first thing they said is, what you do is you put your notes into this system here so that the practice nurse and the doctors can have a look at how the client is doing. And I needed to do that. I needed to comply. I did put that into my contract. But what I also did was I was very mindful of what I placed in those notes. And I think I refer back to, what was the episode, Rory, that you mentioned that's got the note-taking in it? Because I think that's worth looking at.
Episode 136. If you want to see that, go to counsellingtutor.com, our mother website. Just go to the podcast tab and then click on podcast that you can listen to 136.
And if you're on Spotify, just look it up. If you're on Apple, just look it up. 136 is the episode. It goes into what you put in the notes. So we wouldn't put speculation in. We wouldn't put our thoughts, wouldn't put our feelings, our personal considerations in those notes. So what I ended up doing was making my notes rather short. I was keeping to the facts. Client arrived on time. And I was checking at the end of every session, kind of within the summary, checking in with the client, saying, so this is what I feel that we've brought today, what you did today, and just the reminder, that's kind of what the essence of that is, what I'll be putting in the notes that will be stored. And remember, your GP that referred you will be able to look at that. Are you okay with that? So it's almost verbally contracting on a session-by-session basis, because I don't know, it just... It's interesting. I then went on to work in a clinical setting where notes were shared amongst a bank of counsellors as well. It was strange and didn't feel right for me at the time, but now I recognise the need for that. Continuity of care is massive, specifically when there are more professionals involved in the journey, and a client, specifically if they've got something heavy, having to say it again and again and again to different people, that is disrespectful. So having some kind of a pointer, some kind of a reference point, of course, best practice.
I absolutely can, and I think I'll pick up on that observation you made regarding clients having to repeat stories. My mind shift had changed seismically a few years ago, a good few years ago. I'm talking about nearly 15 years ago, when I worked with a client, and I had a policy then, in my own policy. I was qualified of not looking at the notes. I thought that was a kind of respectful position, so I could see the client fresh. So I wasn't looking at them through the prism of someone else's assessment or notes. And I remember the abject disappointment in this person's eye, where they said, with a big sigh, "Oh, so I've got to tell everybody again." And I thought, I'm going to have to rethink my practice. I really am going to. It was all the first time it had happened in I think in the 5 years I've been practicing, and I thought I'm going to have to rethink my practice. And I do now. If I got any referrals, I read the notes. And I also think it brings up another interesting point, Ken, about how we take notes. It needs a different mindset when the difference between, say, writing notes or even typing them up and then entering them onto a different system.
Yeah.
And that mindset is that those notes are not just for our record, they're for other people to look at. So, speaking as someone who's dyslexic, I had to work really, really hard at making sure my notes were clear. Because if someone looked at them and said, "Really don't know what this is about," and especially in areas such as referrals, or if there was a risk element or any actions I'd taken, they had to be really clear, chapter and verse. They had to be quite detailed. If I say I had to speak to, in terms of child protection, I had to speak to a social worker or other colleagues. They had to be really, really clear. So I think it does ask practitioners to have a different mindset, one of which is clarity.
Yeah, very much so. And it boils down to confidentiality at the end of the day, because that's what's in the notes. So somebody is sharing something that is confidential with us. We obviously contract of how that information is captured, who may be able to view that information. But it's also worthwhile checking out what is the organization. So if you're working in an organization and there are multiple people being able to access the notes, what is the policy within that organization regarding confidentiality? Have a look at that policy so that you're able to refer to that in your contracting with your client. So you may say, I capture these notes and they go onto this system, and that the following people are able to have access to those notes. However, they have entered into agreement of confidentiality to also not share any of your information outside of this professional setting. And, so familiarize yourself, ensure that there is a policy. So when I worked at the GP, that was reassuring to me, is that there was a policy there, that everybody within the practice had a professional obligation to confidentiality that they had signed their name to, and disciplinary action would be taken if anybody stepped over that line. And I think that gave me maybe a little bit of peace of mind, and I was able to pass that peace of mind on to my client.
Yeah, absolutely, Ken. And it is very different. We talk about in this section theory and practice. The theory you may learn in the lecture theatre or the classroom about note-taking may be very different to when you actually go out into placement. And I guess as we come to the end of this section, just to say, that if you are inputting your client's records onto the agency system, ask the practice manager about how they frame their policy in terms of the contract, because the contracts and your actions have to match up. So if you are loading up client notes onto the system, as Ken has mentioned, that should be in the contract. Yeah. Should be really clear in the contract. And not only just we store them on a central system, but why? You have to explain to clients, well, we do this, should the counsellor be off, then there's a continuity of care. But yeah, it just shows how the world of counselling and psychotherapy is changing in our electronic time, Ken.
Very, very much so. And I guess one final thought on this, I'm mentioning look at the policies and the procedures within the organization, but also think a little bit outside of those policies and procedures. Think about your day-to-day good practice. So for example, if a client requested their notes, well, what would that look like if you're in an organization where you're inputting it into a system? Do you have the ability to download those notes? Who does have the ability to download that note? Because if the client says, I want my notes from my session, they are entitled to it. It is their information that they have shared, and they may ask for that. How do you get it? I would also look at what is the data protection around my client's notes. And I think this reflects back on something we say quite often on this podcast. It doesn't matter whether you are in private practice or you are in practice within an organization. It is still your practice. You may be under somebody else's roof. You can even be working to their policies and procedures according to their contract, but it is you that is there with that client. You need to assure yourself that you're okay with those policies, procedures that underpin what you are offering. So ask those questions. Ask about the GDPR policy. Ask about if you needed to access notes, how would that work, and familiarize yourself so that if you get asked by a client, you're not caught short in a situation of, oh, well, I'll ask and get back to you. They're sharing the information with you. We have a duty of care. That information for me, and I think this is going right back to full circle to where we started, Rory. Both you and I mentioned when we first found that we had to put notes onto a separate system, there was a discomfort with that. Why?
Definitely.
Because the information that is given to us by a client is so precious. It is so, so precious, and we take our job seriously, and we want to keep it precious, and we want to keep it confidential. So ask the right questions that will underpin your practice, that you feel satisfied and that you're able to give those answers if your client asks. Of course, there's a super duper handout for note-taking that Rory makes. And the super duper handout is called Good Practice in Note-Taking. And you can get that how? Well, you just go to counsellingtutor.com. That is our mother website. Click on the podcast tab. Make your way to today's episode, which is 255, right there on the plate. On the plate. I think I'm thinking of breakfast. On the page, you can download that free handout. It's a PDF download on Good Practice in Note-Taking. Theory to Practice is proudly sponsored by counsellingskillsacademy.com. I'm Ken Kelly, and I've got a real burning passion for counselling skills. I've built training that takes the doubt out of using counselling skills. You get to see the counselling skills used in real live sessions by a qualified therapist. Full sessions, real material, real counselling skills. To find out more, go to counsellingskillsacademy.com. So there it is. That is moving away from theory and practice into practice today, where we look at a contemporary challenge, issue, win that we may be experiencing in counselling at the moment. We spoke in last episode, 254, one episode back, about ethical bodies, about choice. It wasn't last episode, actually, Rory, was it? There's a few episodes back.
252, Ken. 252.
You know the numbers so much better than me, Rory. 252. We spoke about ethical body, choosing an ethical body, maybe changing an ethical body. But today, we go that extra step. What about being a member of two ethical bodies, Rory?
Yes, well, we'll start off, I think, with episode 252, where I charted my journey from one ethical body to another ethical body. And if you want to go and listen to that, it's episode 252 of the Counselling Tutor Podcast. And in our Facebook group, and if you're not a member of our Facebook group, you should really be a member. Go to Facebook, type in Counselling Tutor. You'll find us. We're a very friendly group. Our moderator will let you in, and you can join thousands and thousands of like-minded people talking about the world of counselling and psychotherapy. We have students, we have tutors, we have qualified colleagues, and they're all debating different aspects of counselling and psychotherapy. And interestingly enough, I caught a thread on my changing of ethical bodies, and somebody said, can you be a member of two ethical bodies? Is it possible to be a member of two ethical bodies? And the answer to that is Yes, you can. You can be a member of as many ethical bodies as you want if you want to pay. And here's a thing, Ken. You may know this. Do you know how many ethical bodies are registrants under the umbrella of the Professional Standards Authority?
For counselling and psychotherapy, or in general?
Yeah. For counselling and psychotherapy.
I'm guessing, and I'm going to say between 6 and 8.
11.
Okay, I'm short. Yeah.
Well, it was a bit of a revelation to me. There are 11 psychotherapeutic bodies. One's a hypnotherapy body that are registered under the Professional Standards Authority. Just so we're clear about what that means, is that the Professional Standards Authority are a government organisation that writes standards for professional practice. They don't just write it for, counselling and psychotherapy. It could be chiropody. It could be all sorts of things. There's lots of people who fall under that. It's a voluntary register, so you can choose if you want to join or not when you join the ethical body. But sitting underneath that umbrella of the Professional Standards Authority, the PSA, I'm making a triangle sort of vision as I'm doing this for those who are watching on YouTube, sit these 11 ethical bodies. And they all have different codes of practice. And one are differently worded ethical frameworks. That's probably a better way, a more accurate way of describing it. And the question was, if you're a member of 2 ethical bodies, what happens if someone makes a complaint? Which ethical body do they make the complaint to?
Yeah.
And can they make a complaint to 2 ethical bodies? And interestingly, someone in the Facebook group pointed us to an article, a blog article written by a solicitor at Kingsley Napley, who specialise in law around procedures within organisations. It's written by the partner Julie Norris, and there's some legal precedent. And what happened in 2016? There's a complaint levied against a practitioner who was a member of the UKCP and the BACP. The UKCP took the complaint and they what we call disposed of it. So in terms of discipline, disciplinary procedures, a complaint's either upheld or it's disposed of. If it's upheld, then there's a process of kind of sanctioning the therapist, or in some cases striking them off if the conduct is particularly bad. But if it's disposed of, it means they've looked at it and they said there's no case to answer, and they dismissed it. So the client went to the second ethical body the person was registered with and made a complaint, and they started a process of investigation. And the therapist went to law, and there is now a precedent, and the precedent is that you cannot be held accountable under 2 ethical bodies. If one has disposed of it, then it's possible, and I have to be very careful because I'm not a lawyer here, that the other ethical body will have to take that and say, well, one, it's been dealt with by one ethical body and it's been disposed of. So, can we hear it? Because obviously another ethical body has disposed of it. Interestingly enough, this judgment was issued, I think, in 2016, 7 years ago now. And of course, ethical bodies have updated their codes of ethics and obviously their disciplinary procedures in there. But it does leave the question, if you're a member of 2 ethical bodies, which ethical body do you say to the client that handles their complaint?
Yeah. Yeah. And I looked over the case you've just spoken about, and of course we'll pop a link in the show notes for you. When you go and get your super duper handout, you can click on that link and go and see this write up on this. And it makes sense to me in that, because you mentioned that professional standards sits over all of the ethical bodies, they should all be working to the same set of rules. Now, they may interpret those rules slightly differently. If you look at ethical frameworks, they may be slightly different, but they're all going to come down to the same thing. So the thinking is that one ethical body should be finding the same as another ethical body if they're following the same rule set. So it's interesting. But of course, there's people within. So if a complaint is made, it's made to a person, and it's usually reviewed by a board, which is people, and people have their thoughts and opinions. And even when there is a guided process, it's very easy to come to a different decision. And it was very interesting to me. One of the questions that came up for me when I was looking at this is, when a client, when we see a new client, often one of our first questions is, are you seeing another counsellor or psychotherapist? And we ask them that for a very good reason, because if they are, they may well take the same presentation to another therapist and get a different outcome. It's just the nature of how it is. It's again because it's two different people, and that may be confusing for a client. So within my practice, I wouldn't have taken a client if they were seeing another therapist unless there was a very good reason for it. So a good reason might be, yes, I'm seeing a specialist addictions therapist for an addiction I have, but I want to work with the results of that addiction with another therapist. I would gladly take them on. But if it was two different therapists, it would be questionable for me. I'd be asking why that is and taking that to supervision. Then I asked myself, could I have two different supervisors for the same clients? So I understand, again, that we can have different supervisors. We've spoken about this before. Different supervisors for maybe our online work. We would take those clients to one supervisor who's qualified to supervise in online and telephone working, and we might take face-to-face in the room client to a different supervisor. That I get. But if we took the same client to two different supervisors, would we not get mixed messaging, maybe conflicting ideas? And then I took that and extrapolated it slightly and said, should I join two ethical bodies? And it comes from me, and this is just my personal thought. Yes, of course you can. You can join more than one ethical body, and many are. But for me, I would be asking myself, why would I need that? I'd need to be able to justify it for myself, I guess, which at the moment I can't.
Yeah, and I'll pick up on that point. It's about justification, isn't it? Yeah. So we don't want to, first of all, we're not legal experts. We're just two colleagues having a talk about a topic that's come up in a Facebook page. And certainly we know that people are listening may be members of two ethical bodies. And I think there's a principal position of having membership of two bodies. So I'm looking at the 11 bodies that are registered. And one of them is the Association of Child Psychotherapists. So it's very possible that you could have two distinct practices as a therapist. You could have an adult practice and you could have a child practice. And it may be that you would join the Association of Child Psychotherapists for your child work. Another interesting sort of ethical body is the Association of Christian Counsellors. Yes. And that gives a sort of religious faith position flavour to those who practice under their faith. And I would expect that this list that I'm looking at expands. I wouldn't be surprised in the next few years if we don't see Association of Muslim counsellors, because obviously that's a growing edge of faith and influence within our society. And also, of course, there is societies for psychologists, British psychological societies. Our friends COSCA in Scotland, they have they are technically a different country or a different region, so they have their own. And then, National Hypnotherapy Society for people who are practicing a slightly different form of therapy. So there can be a good reason for people to be in two ethical bodies, but it does give the rise to the question: which ethical body should you be saying to your clients in your contract you can make a complaint against?
Yes.
So that's really it. It was a very interesting exploration of something that I've not really thought too much about, Ken, to be honest.
Me neither. I enjoyed the reading, I must say. It's got me thinking, and that's what I like about these topics, Rory, is it starts me thinking. I get the processes start flowing. And with your argument there, I really like that of, there are going to be times and reasons why you would choose to be a member of more than one ethical body. I was sitting nodding as you were outlining those reasons. So I think it is. It's about you. It's about your choice. and just maybe considering. I was thinking as well, if you have an ethical dilemma and you want to phone up for ethical advice, if you phoned the two ethical bodies, would you get the same advice? Would you get differing advice? It's just an interesting area. I think one that deserves more of a discussion. Get into the Facebook group and continues this discussion. Are you a member of two or maybe even more ethical bodies? Pop in and say how that is for you. Let's keep this discussion going. Go to Facebook, put in Counselling Tutor, and you're in. It's that simple. But there you have it. Well, thank you for bringing that, Rory. That is our practice today. Contemporary issues, challenges, and wins in counselling. And now on to the CPD part of the Counselling Tutor Podcast, where we look at practice matters, an element that we may come across in our day-to-day running of a practice. And today, overcoming procrastination. This is something I know so well, especially from my study days. Oh my goodness, could I procrastinate? I think I've got a black belt in procrastination, Rory. And this is Josephine Hughes that you met up with, Rory.
Indeed, as my late mother used to say, procrastination is the thief of time. That's it was always echoed in our house growing up. Yes, I caught up with Josephine Hughes, who's done a fantastic lecture on overcoming procrastination for counsellors for the CSR and the CPD library. And this is what she had to say.
Practice matters.
The National Counselling Society is proud to sponsor Practice Matters. National Counselling Society are really excited to have launched their Children and Young People Therapist Register for counsellors working with the younger age group. To find out more, visit nationalcounselingsociety.org. nationalcounselingsociety.org.
One of the many challenges that practitioners may face, be they students or qualified practitioners, is overcoming perfection and self-sabotage. It can be very debilitating and effectively really hold people back from fulfilling their potential and greatness. I'm going to use the word greatness. So I'm delighted to welcome Josephine Hughes, who's done a fantastic lecture entitled Overcoming Perfection and Self-Sabotage for the Counselling CSR Library and for the Counsellor CPD Library. So Josephine Hughes, thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, well, thanks very much for inviting me along. I'm looking forward to a good chat.
Yes, we're going to have a bit of a chat, aren't we? Yeah. And certainly from my own experience, certainly as a student, self-perfectionism can be quite a crippling kind of aspect to somebody, can't it? An effect. Yeah. And I just wonder how commonplace this is, do you think, for therapists in general?
I think I mean, when you look at how many people suffer from, say, imposter syndrome and the statistics vary, but they do say up to 70% of people can experience this imposter syndrome. And I think sort of perfectionism is very much tied in with that. And when I first had therapy, I realised with my therapist that I suffered from this sort of not good enough feeling. And I thought it was just me. And then when I started working with clients, I realised that actually clients felt a lot of it as well. And then I opened it up to other counsellors when I started up my Facebook group, and I discovered that there's an awful lot of counsellors who feel not good enough as well. And I think, I honestly think it's a lot to do with, it's connected to when we're doing something new. So especially for students, this is the first time that people will have practiced and done their role plays, and you're doing it obviously in front of people, you're doing it in front of your fellow peers who are on the course with you, and you've got an observer. So it's terrifying. And I think it definitely comes out. And I think because of that fear, you are trying to be as good as you can. And we'll probably go on and talk about why that is. But yeah, I think it's really common. And I think, even when you've qualified, even then, you're just starting out, you can always find someone who's better than you.
Yes, in your mind. Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Because you're obviously not watching anybody. But, and the thing is, people will, especially when I was a student, I came across people who said, oh, yeah, this is the difference I made to a client, and we did this, that, and the other. And I'd sit there thinking, oh, I don't think I've done anything like that. And of course, you always compare your weaknesses with someone else's strengths. And so that makes you feel sort of not good enough. And I think that brings out perfectionism as well.
Absolutely. I often wonder if it's a cultural thing. I think, I may speak in a generalisation and even heaven forbid stereotype here, but I do think that the British psyche is one of self-deprecation a little bit, and one of not wanting to be too big-headed, as my mother used to say. No one likes a big head, I was told as a young person, and it does send out a very strong message, doesn't it? That big-headedness equals, confidence, or self, a confidence in what you're doing. And I sometimes think the messages we get in general, as parents, as children, can sometimes affect that. But I want to pick up on the point of this starting in training. I know as someone who's trained therapists for over a decade, I literally had students who were virtually having panic attacks and, hopefully nothing worse, having to do skills. And it really does start there, doesn't it? And I think it's about the shape of the training, and maybe how the person who's doing the teaching approaches the fact that it's good to make mistakes. That's where we learn.
Yeah. And I think I love the concept of the fixed mindset and the growth mindset. And I think many of us have grown up with a fixed mindset where we think almost we've got to prove ourselves. Whereas if you can move into the growth mindset, that is where, it is possible. You see it as a skill that you've got to learn, and that making mistakes is actually integral to the process. And I can remember when I was listening back to my recordings when I was writing up essays for my level 4 diploma, that actually that process of listening and listening and listening again to the recordings taught me so much, because I could hear when I'd gone off and I hadn't heard the client properly, and I could hear where the client wanted to say more. And it was so helpful. And I think that's the way we learn. But, we can so easily not listen to that learning and try and gloss over it because we're so frightened of what it might mean if we're sort of stuck in this fixed mindset. But if we can move into that growth mindset, I think that can be really helpful to us.
I think that's really helpful. I think the growth mindset is one of always being open to experience and change and development and critique. I think that, no one likes critique, I don't think, but I think it's the way it's put. And also it's a very necessary part of growing, isn't it?
Absolutely. Yeah, it is. And I just sort of love the research that was done around the growth mindset where they sort of sat with children, and the ones that had the growth mindset would say, oh, please, can I take difficult jigsaws home with me? Because they wanted to actually learn from the difficulty. Whereas those of us who have a fixed mindset, we tend to sort of like push that away. We're not prepared to meet the challenge because we think it says something about us. So being able to be open and learning from that critique can be really helpful. And I think it makes us better counsellors.
Absolutely. I remember as a young person growing up listening to the former President John F. Kennedy talking about the moonshot. And I can remember his speech, virtually word for word. And part of it was, we do these things because they are difficult. We don't do them because they're easy. And it was a real rallying call to the fact that we're going to the moon. We've never done this before. And it's going to be difficult, but that's where we're going. And he made it, I think it was 2 years earlier. They landed in 1969, I think.
Yeah. And
I always thought of that as a very powerful call to action, and one that I've tried to enable in myself. In a wider context of perfectionism, I'm thinking about societal structures and how people view themselves. And for many, 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 many years, people have believe them to, have struggled, with things like sexuality and being their true selves. Does perfectionism impact on that, do you think?
Yeah, hugely, I think, because I think what it is when we're in a perfectionist mindset, we're actually, in a sense, we're seeking to protect ourselves. And what is perfection? How do we define perfection. And I think what we're doing is we tend to make ourselves subject to that sort of external locus of evaluation.
Yes.
We've got to appear to be all right to everybody else. And that means that we're not really allowing ourselves to be who we are, and we're not listening to our own internal locus of evaluation. I think perfectionism is very outward focused. It's about being acceptable to other people. And of course, that means that, I mean, when I sort of really suffered with perfectionism, I was very much a people pleaser, because I always had to meet other people's expectations as to what was good. And that stops us from being able to listen to ourselves and listen to our true identity, I think.
Absolutely. And I know in our preamble, before we pressed the record button, you spoke of a new podcast that you're releasing, talking about issues that are very close to yourself.
Yeah. So I've just released a podcast called Gloriously Unready, and it's about my journey as a parent with my children. And I think sort of the way it's relevant to this particular conversation is that, I'd placed so much store in my children's gender, because in a sense, I'd extended who I was into my children. And then when they changed and that got taken away, it made me really have to recalibrate myself and look at who I was rather than who I was through my children. And I think, in many ways, as mothers, as parents, what we can do is we can expect perfection of our children, because it says something about us. And we make it about us. And the journey that I went through as a parent, and it is a sort of a wonderful way of being challenged, really, when your children come out as, say, transgender. It just questions so much of the assumptions that you held close. And it makes you really sort of think again about the way you are in the world and what it means to you and what your children mean as well. So it's all sort of connected, and it's part of how I sort of started thinking more closely about who I was as a person, really, and started questioning this perfectionism.
Absolutely. And it speaks to the growth mindset, doesn't it? That we have to look at our opinions, inspect them and adapt them or change them, or hold to opinions. I have to say to my daughter, esoteric thinking is about holding two contrary opinions and looking at both of them without any kind of a fear. And it does, this idea of perfectionism does go across the piece, even I think to modalities of therapy, where people get perhaps wedded to one modality and close themselves off to any other modality that may be of help to the client. Is that your experience?
Yeah, I think it's a really sort of interesting point, because I think the whole point about the fixed mindset is it makes us very rigid. And it's about sort of proving ourselves, and we're not prepared to take risks. And I think sometimes when you're looking at what does your client need, there is that sense of, can I take a risk here? Can I try something different? Am I prepared to make a mistake? And I think often what we do in therapy is, because we so want to help client, we can be very, very frightened of doing the wrong thing. And that can keep us very rigidly, perhaps, in our particular modality, rather than being that sort of fluidity and seeing what can work. Because whenever we try something new, to a certain extent, I think we might be sort of almost skating on thin ice in a way. We're not quite sure. Will the ice be thick enough to hold us up? Do we know enough? Will it be all right? And yet that then comes in that whole thing about sort of rupture and repair and the modelling to the client as well. Because if we're expecting ourselves to be perfect, what is that telling our clients? And so, there's that whole human aspect that can come in as well, the whole relationship aspect of it.
Absolutely. I mean, I've told this story to death, and people may be switching off now as I recount it again.
I haven't heard it.
In that case, you're probably the only person who hasn't. But many years ago, I remember doing a summary with a client. I was summing up, and as I was going through it, part of me was thinking, this is absolutely rubbish.
Yeah.
And I got to the end, and I said to the client, I said, I'm sorry, that was a rubbish summary. And she said to me, I was a child therapist, and she said, your children are disarmingly honest. And she said, yes, it was, wasn't it? And I said, yes. And we both had a laugh about it. And off she went, and I wrote my notes up. And when she came back the next week, she kind of looked at me and kind of captured me with only a gaze a young person can can have. And she said, how do you summarise this? And I've got better. She said, we'll see. And what happened from that point of me getting it wrong was that we developed a different and I think deeper relationship. And also she saw it was all right to get it wrong. She'd been surrounded by people who were told you can't get it wrong. And as a consequence, for me to get it wrong was a bit of an eye-opener, I think.
Yeah, it's very refreshing, isn't it? And I think, one of the things that they say is that one of the reasons we can be perfectionists is because that's what's been modelled to us. We've got parents who have very high standards of themselves perhaps, and they expect high standards of us. And if we don't meet those high standards and we get rejected and criticised, that can make us want to bring that perfectionism in. And so to have someone who's prepared to model that it's okay to get things wrong and it's not the end of the world can be a really powerful thing, I think.
Absolutely.
Really powerful.
Absolutely. And it's one that, of course, Carl Rogers spoke about so much, conditions of worth and introjected values. As we come to the end of this interview, Josephine, I wonder, for those who may watch the lecture, I wonder what you hope they will take away from it.
I think that... that willingness to be prepared to take a risk and to know that you can only be the best therapist that you can be at this point in your development, and that when you take risks, if you make mistakes, you can still learn from them, and you've got your supervisor, you can take it to supervision, you can talk it through. And I guess as well, from that point of view, sometimes I think people are really frightened about supervision, and they're frightened of letting supervisors see the rubbish stuff. But that's how we grow. And so, I'd really love to encourage people as well to find supervisors who they really feel they can be completely open with, and to take that. I mean, my supervisor sometimes says to me, thank you for being so open. And I just sort of think, why wouldn't I want to be open? Because that's how I grow. So, use your supervisor, take the things that don't work well, because that's how you're going to be a better therapist. And after all, that's what we want. We want to help people. So, if we can. And the other thing I think I'd just sort of add that I've sort of found really helpful when I was thinking about my podcast is, I worried so much about, was it going to be good enough? And in the end, I realised that my worth doesn't depend on my podcast succeeding. And I think it's really important for us to come back to that our worth doesn't depend on what we do. Our worth is who we are, and that's a given. And that, we might get it wrong in our lives, in our counselling, but our worth doesn't depend on that. And there's a whole section about self-compassion in the training that talks a bit more about that.
Overcoming Perfection and Self-Sabotage is available in the Counsellors CSR Library and the Counselling CPD Library. Josephine Hughes, thank you so much for joining us.
Massive thank you to Josephine Hughes. Thank you to you, Rory, as always, for kind of reaching out, finding the experts, bringing us the interesting topics. And of course, if you enjoyed what you heard from Josephine, there is a full lecture because of the importance of this topic and a kind of its broad reach. It is in the Counselling Study Resource for Students, because you can face procrastination during your studies, and it is also in our CPD library for qualified practitioners, the same lecture, because it applies equally to both. If you're a member of those, just log in, and that lecture is now there and available for you. If you're not a member of either of our libraries and you're interested, go to counsellingtutor.com. All the information is right there on the homepage. On how to join. And this has been episode 255 of the Counselling Tutor Podcast.
Yes, we started without any procrastination with theory in practice. We talked about story notes, differing expectations of placements. We moved on and had an interesting discussion about being a member of two ethical bodies in practice today. And then in Practice Matters, I met up with Josephine Hughes, who talks about overcoming procrastination. And as always, stay grounded and stay safe.
Take the stress out of your counselling studies and get the support of Rory and I by joining us in the Counselling Study Resource. See how Counselling Study Resource can help you. Visit counsellingtutor.com. That's counsellingtutor.com.
Thank you for listening to the Counselling Tutor Podcast. Find the show notes for this episode on our website at www.counsellingtutor.com.